このビルに ATM がありますか? Is there an ATM in this building? So here, ga sounds pretty weird. It sounds pretty awkward. It's like you walk up to a security guard and just declare, is it indeed in this building where the ATM is? Which gives you too much main character energy. It's just too much for real life. And I also asked other native speakers to make sure that this is not just my opinion, and everybody said, yeah, ga sounds weird. There's actually many natural versions you can use, but interestingly, we all agreed that we would personally say, このビルに ATM ってありますか? Using て which is a very common colloquial particle, and it also kind of softens the sentence. Now, in a more formal situation, like in a formal interview, we might use は, so it's gonna sound like このビルに ATM はありますか? But if you are just asking somebody if there's an ATM in the building, it's probably not a very formal situation. Like maybe you're asking a receptionist or a guard. But in a more formal interview, and you're asking a politician if they have enough 予算 budget, you can say something like 予算はありますか? Do you have the budget? But there's actually many possible variations. For example, you can say このビルって ATM ありますか? Which emphasizes this building. So it means something like, oh, there was an ATM in the other building, but how about this building? And you can even use て twice and say, このビルって ATM ってありますか? Which is like, do you happen to have an ATM in this building? So a slightly different nuance. Now, some people say in written text, using は like, このビルは ATM はありますか? Some people don't like it, like using many wa in a row. But in spoken Japanese, this is completely fine. You know, communication and the message are more important than how the sentence would look in print. Like nobody cares. So there's many possible situations, but a particle that we wouldn't use is actually ga. Even though in other situations, we might use ga. For example, to answer this question, you can use 隣 next and say, ATM があるのは隣のビルです。The building that has the ATM is the next building. So here, ga works perfectly fine. And again, what's correct depends on the context. You don't always have a single particle you can use regardless of the situation. So if you ignore the situation and always use the same particle, like many textbooks, it can sound pretty weird. Context matters. But of course, some of the sentences in Minna Nihongo are totally fine. For example, the second phrase, はい、2階にあります. Yes, it's on the second floor. This is completely fine. There's no problem at all. So sentences in Minna Nihongo are hit or miss, just like Takopi's happy dog. And if you want to learn natural and practical Japanese, maybe you can join my email group because I have both free and paid lessons where you can acquire Japanese with natural but easy and properly contextualized examples. So click on the link in the description or on the screen to subscribe to my email group, Japanese with Yuta.